It's really a pleasure and an honor to welcome back to the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia, Tom Donilon. I'll say again, if folks are having conversations, take them out of the room, please. Tom's the chairman of the BlackRock Investment Institute. He served as the national security advisor to President Barack Obama. He's worked for and advised numerous presidents, dating, I won't embarrass you, but dating back to President Carter, and serves on numerous boards and advisory boards, including our own advisory board at the Center on Global Energy Policy. He's also my former boss, and I've been fortunate to count him as a mentor and to benefit from his generosity and time and counsel, his immense foreign policy expertise, legendary preparation and work ethic, deep commitment to public service, really provides a model, not just for me, but I think for all of us, and including the students who are in this room today. When we launched the Center on Global Energy Policy in April of 2013, we had two keynote speakers that day, then Mayor Michael Bloomberg and the National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon. And on that day, Tom talked about the geopolitical implications of the dramatic changes that we were seeing at that time from the US becoming a large net importer to a much larger producer and eventually exporter of energy. And we also talked about climate change and why climate change was an important and urgent national security risk. But it was interesting, Tom started his remarks, I went back and read them, by saying at the opening of his keynote how unusual it was for a national security advisor to speak at an energy and climate conference. And I was struck rereading that, especially after this weekend, because I don't think anyone today would say such a thing. We see every day how foreign policy is deeply intertwined with the energy transition and climate change. So we're going to jump right in. We've got so much to talk about. We will not have enough time. But I want to start with events of the weekend, Tom. We're in a moment that seems rife with conflict, potential conflict in Israel, Gaza, Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan. So let's start with the events of the weekend in Israel. And it seems like 24, 48 hours later, there's this conversation about whether this was for show and performative, and Iran had to do something to retaliate for Damascus, but they signaled it was coming, and you can see it's not hard to shoot down 300 missiles and drones, so this is all should end now. Or this is a really significant and unprecedented kind of escalation, direct from Iran, direct into Israel. Talk about how you see it, and particularly what that might mean for the Israeli response coming next.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. And it's terrific to be here, back here at the center. And I just wanted to, before I start, say what a terrific job you've done here, and what a terrific job has been done by the center, really, in providing just spectacularly high-quality intellectual capital in the climate and energy area. Really, you know, in just 10 really short years, right? It really has become a kind of a go-to resource, I think, for the world in these areas, right? Rigorous, fair-minded, quite useful for policymakers, I think, around the world. So congratulations on the work that you've done here at the center. I was proud to have been here the first day when we walked in. On Israel and the Middle East, right? I don't think you can say what happened over the weekend. You can't really call it performative, right? It was a serious attack at a serious time when I think we're not through the cycle at this point, frankly. So a couple of points to lead into it, right? One, it was, Jason, an unprecedented and direct attack on Israel. Right? You know, this had not happened. We had not had a situation where Iran had, from Iranian territory, attacked Israel and Israel proper. And when I say never, I mean since the founding of the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979. So it was a change, right, in what had been the circumstances in the Middle East. So it was direct. It was unprecedented, right? Second is, and it goes to your question about whether it's performative or not. It was large scale. Now it had been telegraphed, right? And I think it was probably intended to keep in its focus on military targets. But it was a large scale attack. Over 300 projectiles were fired from Iran, but also from other places around Israel. It was a multi-dimensional attack with different kinds of armaments being fired at Israel to try to evade the Israeli air defense and rocket defense systems. It was intended to do significant damage because The Iranians could not have had any idea that we would have had, that we, the United States and the Israelis and others in the coalition, would have had a 99% success rate in taking down the projectiles that were targeted at Israel. The defense was highly effective, right? And I think that's a testament to the progress that the Israelis have made in terms of their systems. But it also would not have been anywhere near as effective, I don't think, if it hadn't been for the coordinated, integrated defense that had been put in place in the Middle East, right? Led by the United States. And our Central Command, so-called CENTCOM, has been deeply involved in this for a number of years. And I think we saw it pay off over the weekend, involving the United States and then and UK and France and Jordan and other countries in the region. So really kind of an important point, I think, that this was a large-scale attack on Israel that was taken down by an extraordinary performance of an integrated air defense system. Now, there is no guarantee that you get a 99% success rate, right, on one of these things every time that it happens, right? Now, the Iranians have expended, it's an important, part of their armaments, but you can't really count on that kind of performance, I don't think, obviously, in every circumstance. Now, you asked kind of what had changed, right, in the Middle East as a result.
Iran seemed to say, like, we're done now, and then the Biden administration wants everything to get calm. Oil prices fall the next morning, notwithstanding. So
I think that's right, and the Iranians, the United States, obviously, at least publicly, has been saying that they would urge caution and prudence at this point, right, in proceeding further. And the Iranians declared it kind of the end of the cycle, but there was a change. Right, and the change was this direct attack on Israel from Iran.
And how do you think Israel
responds? And the declaration by the Iranians that this was quote unquote a new equation, right? And that in fact what they say is that any time now Israel attacks an Iranian interest or person, right, that they would respond directly to Israel, and in many cases from Iran. That's a change. And so, although in the short term here, right, maybe it hasn't escalated, right, kind of out of the events of the weekend. Long term, it is a structural increase in the risk profile in the region because of that dynamic that you could have with Iran attacking Israel directly and Israel responding. Now, on the response, the Israeli War Cabinet has met, I think, for the fifth time. Met 5 times to consider their response. I think they're trying to calibrate this, right? Establishing deterrence, right? Saying that kind of an attack of that scale on Israel, which did result in a few getting through and actually doing some damage to a Israeli air base in southern Israel. That's not acceptable. So we have to establish deterrence at the same time, not launching a response, right, that would escalate the situation. I think that's what the Israeli War Cabinet is wrestling with right now. I do think there'll be a response, though. I think the response. It's hard to. I don't think from this distance at this point that we can kind of predict what the timing, the scope, scale will be. But I think there will be a response from. So the cycle is not complete, and there's been an increase, I think, in the structural risk profile in the region, as I said. Now, one thing though. I'll finish up on this if I might, that we haven't, that shouldn't be forgotten, is that Israel is in the midst of a war effort in southern Israel and in Gaza, which is nowhere near completion. The next military target for the Israelis is probably a southern city in Israel, in Gaza, called Rafah. There are probably 3 or 4 Hamas brigades that remain to be dealt with in southern Gaza, but there are also 1.2 million, 1.3 million Gazans who have been displaced, right, and who are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. This is the challenge. This was the challenge that the United States and Israel were trying to work through before the events of this weekend, which is to address the legitimate security concern, right, of remaining 3 or 4 brigades of Hamas, right, with the need to do a much better job at dealing with the humanitarian situation, and even further down the line, to deal with some sort of perspective, if you will, on governance in Gaza post-conflict. We're not anywhere near conclusions on this, so we are really quite, I think, early in the Gaza story, and it's been it's a tragic story. It's a tragic story on October 7th, obviously. It's been a tragic story inside Gaza, with the numbers now. You can argue about the numbers, but 30,000 dead, maybe 12,000 children. It's a dramatic. Humanitarian situation needs to be addressed. I'm quite, my wife is Kathy Russell is the CEO of UNICEF, right? And so this is a conversation you can imagine that I have a lot at home. Lots of challenges.
When you look at where things might be headed with the horrific conflict and suffering in Gaza, possibility of a ceasefire, of talks about a two-state solution, of Israel-Saudi normalization, of a security guarantee for Saudi, all of these things that were out there, how do they look different today after the attack this weekend than they did before?
I think number one is I do think the Israelis will be determined to deal with the security situation in southern Gaza. Number one. Number two, the issues that you talked about, the humanitarian situation, the government situation, the security situation, remain in front of us, and I think that's going to require kind of setting forth a perspective on what governance looks like in Gaza and with Palestinians generally. That's going to involve, I think, much more intense involvement from the major Arab states. I think to try to address this going forward. So these are kind of all in front of us here, and we're kind of I don't even know that we're midstream in trying to dealing with kind of the outcomes of the Hamas launched war on October 7th. The other thing that is of concern to me as a security person, right, is the longer this goes on, I am become increasingly concerned about knock-on effects in terms of terrorism, right, in Europe and the United States, especially in Europe. The numbers in Europe right now of potential of threats, right, and plots that were foiled are very high, particularly against, in all cases, but particularly against Jewish interests, Jewish people, and Jewish institutions. And the longer this goes on, Jason, I think the more you have to worry about knock-on terrorist effects around the world. The last thing I'll say is we also have a situation brewing in the northern part of Israel, on the Lebanon-Israeli border, which has been going on since October 8th. We say it's been controlled, okay, but there's been I think the Israelis have been pretty aggressive, and I think have killed 250 Hezbollah fighters in the north, and at the same time, the Israelis people, right, have been displaced. There's 60,000 Israelis who don't live in their homes today, right? I don't think Israel will allow this to go on indefinitely, and I think clearly not into the next school year. I don't think. Now, our friend in the administration, Amos Hochstein, is working on this problem. This is his diplomatic job that he's focused on right now, which is trying to find a diplomatic solution to getting a more secure border arrangement.
So I wanted to ask if you could put this in a broader context of what you see happening in the world right now. I saw a poll recently with a recent poll of 500 institutional investors that talked about how geopolitics was the number one risk to the global economy that they see in 2024. I was wondering, from your standpoint, how you see it. Is that right? And how has that landscape and set of risks, how do they look today? How have they evolved in the 10 years since you joined us on day one?
It's not recognizable from 10 years ago, Jason. Essentially, I think the way I've thought about this is we're now in kind of the third really serious geopolitical set of changes that we've had since World War II. We had, obviously, the Cold War in the wake of World War II, the kind of the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. And then in the late 80s, 89 to 91, we had the kind of the coming out of the post-Cold War period, right, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the integration into the global economy of China and Eastern Europe. And that world, which was characterized, it had specific characteristics, right, it was a lot U.S. dominance, a agreement basically on integration, right, of both China and Russia and former members of the Soviet bloc into the global economy and global institutions. Integration was the watchword of the day, right? You had a large, significant degree of cooperation and coordination between the great powers at that point, and you had an agreement really on economic management, globalization and the Washington Consensus, right? Lower tariffs, smaller government, less regulation, right? And that was essentially what was agreed on, I think, pretty generally in the world. That world is in the rearview mirror. If you think about just the fragmentation issue, about the kind of the coordination and cooperation among great powers, I was talking to someone earlier coming in here today. So one of the first assignments I had from President Obama was to work on the G20 summit in London in April of 2009. And the purpose of that summit was to deal with the great financial crisis. And around the table was seated the newly elected President of the United States, Barack Obama, the then President of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev, the then head of the General Secretary and President of China, Hu Jintao. Gordon Brown was hosting, a number of Europeans, right, and developed a joint plan to deal with the great financial crisis. That meeting would not take place today on any topic. And that, I think, in a nutshell, shows, I think, the degree of change and fragmentation. You know, we're talking about Iran. Jason, as you know, I oversaw the pressure effort for 4.5 years on Iran. And our partners in that pressure effort were the permanent members of the Security Council that included Russia and China. And of course, they're in a very different position right now with respect to the United States and with respect to Iran and North Korea. So, a dramatic change, I think, Jason, in kind of the geopolitical lineup, if you will. So, more fragmentation for sure. Less cooperation, less effective in operation, I think, of the international institutions. And then really, I think, importantly, just two other quick ones, a rewiring and a rethinking of globalization to some extent. Now, it's not deglobalization, right, because the trade numbers hold up pretty well, but it's a very different approach, I think, to economic management, right, and this kind of rewiring and kind of building out as a result of these blocks. In the United States, by the way, you've seen a very different approach to economic management, right? International economic management. And it's Jake Sullivan, and it's a speech that really bears careful reading and rereading. Yeah. Jake Sullivan's speech at Brookings in April of 2023 essentially said that the neoliberal approach to managing international economics and U.S. economics had failed. It had failed on three fronts: China, inequality, and climate. And that a new approach was necessary, including large-scale government interventions into markets, right? And we've seen that out of the Biden administration in a number of areas. The two other things that I think have changed, and I'll shut up on this one, is a really serious increase in defense expenditures around the world. Because we have more unstable, volatile situations in the world, more chances of conflict, and a standoff, if you will, an increasing standoff between the major blocs, the United States and West and Europe and its partners in Asia, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, increasingly work more closely together than they have in decades on the other side, and you have an increase in defense monies. And the last thing is a really serious, I know it's something you all pay attention to, a serious degradation in the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Mm-hmm. Between the United States and Russia right now, we're down to just one treaty essentially limiting us, the New START agreement, which we worked on in the Obama years, and that in a year or so goes out of being. So it's those are the characteristics today, I think, of the world that we're dealing with, and I think that's reflected in the survey that you talked about at the beginning of the question.
So this is a really important issue for our ability to have a clean energy transition, because right now, so much of those supply chains for clean energy, solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles, critical minerals, China plays a very significant, one might say dominant role in. So that speech you talked about with Jake, where you talked about a small yard with a high fence, there's a small number of very sensitive defense, security technologies we're concerned about, but beyond that, we want a lot of trade. It's not clear how small the yard really is, and I'm wondering, when you look at how U.S. foreign policymakers are or should view China, is it an adversary? Is it a competitor? What does that mean for how much of a cooperative or confrontational approach to take? And what does that mean when we're trying to ensure supply chain resilience, economic competitiveness, national security? But we got to grow clean energy supply chains, among other things, really fast.
Well, because they're competing policy priorities, I think. On the U.S.-China relationship, I think there was a significant meeting last November between President Biden and President Xi. And since that, there has been an effort on both sides to stabilize the relationship and to do two or three things. I would take stabilization measures, including multiple visits back and forth. Janet Yellen, Secretary of the Treasury, was in China for a week last week. The tone of the relationship, I think, has changed. And third, most importantly, I think, the military-to-military communications were reopened as a result of that summit. So you have now, I think, a more stable, well-managed situation. But I think it is tactical, and that underneath that remains kind of the new normal, right? Which is a highly competitive dynamic, I think, Jason, between the United States and China that will continue. And it's focused in a few areas, and you touched on one, which is technology, which affects, obviously, the climate agenda. And on the technology side, the United States and China are engaged in a kind of a large-scale competition to seize the commanding heights. Dan Jurgen's here someplace. I'm sure he'll recognize that phrase, right? To seize the commanding heights of technology leadership of the 21st century. And that's rooted in an understanding, right, of kind of what's important from a military perspective, but also what's important from an economic perspective as well. And that's the dynamic, I think, that we're in. So you see things like, a very aggressive effort on the U.S. side to do two things, right? One, to advance its technological lead, but second, also to protect its economy and its workers, right? And you see a whole range, right? We could spend a morning going through the range of steps the United States has taken in order to try to achieve those goals, starting with export controls on high-end semiconductors, but going all the way to a number of other steps that we've taken, again, here. And we'll see this, by the way, kind of combination of technological competition and goals that will have to kind of stand beside, right, and have to be balanced with the climate goals, right, with respect to electric vehicles and everything. I think that's coming. You saw Janet Yellen last week, as I said, was in China and made quite clear that there were a number of concerns the United States had, even though we're kind of engaged in this kind of more stable back and forth. And one of them was China trying to export its way out of its growth challenges through exporting its overcapacity. And though, the President Xi has been quite clear about what his priorities are in terms of that overcapacity, right? In terms of new productive forces, is the way he would phrase it. And they are electric vehicles, batteries, and solar panels and other clean technology. That is going to be the next big trade set of issues, I think, coming forward. The other one, by the way, is going to be on China's support of the Russian industrial base in the war in Ukraine. But that's another meeting.
I wanted to ask you
that's
about
another meeting.
Russia, Ukraine as one other geopolitical hotspot, of course. So the U.S. is having trouble finding political consensus to provide funding for Ukraine, and Zelensky warns that without that, the military may be forced into retreat. Can you tell us where you see the conflict now? What does success for Ukraine look like? And if that's possible to use that word, the likelihood of full Russian retreat seems low. Right. And what implications does this have for European security or other things around the world, Taiwan or anything else more broadly? There's a lot there.
There's a lot there. But I'll say a couple of things. One is that there's been success, right, that we should not miss with respect to Ukraine. In February 2022, when the Russians invaded Ukraine, I think most folks thought that essentially they would succeed, right? And that, and the Russian goal at that point was to decapitate the government, right? Put in place someone who would respond to Moscow, right? And essentially kind of end the effort of Ukraine to kind of tie itself more closely with the West. And that didn't happen for a number of reasons, including obviously the courageous fighting by the Ukrainian people, right? And pushing back the initial assault. It also had to do kind of with the low quality at that point and kind of deep corruption in the Russian military. But it had a lot to do with, over the longer haul, with the United States and the West supporting Ukraine, which is essential. Because you get in these battles, right, some cases, right, in many cases are kind of a battle of industrial bases, right? And the correlation of forces between Russia and Ukraine on the natural, right, is weighed heavily towards Russia. Mm-hmm. And what's happened is that through this effort led by the United States and with close coordination with European and other partners, right, by the way, around the world, has been to more even out this correlation of forces to give the Ukrainians an opportunity to defend themselves, right, in their battle with Russia. That's absolutely essential. Absent that support, evening out the level of correlation of forces, the Ukrainians are in a very difficult circumstance. I think that's the circumstance you have right now. And the two areas where they are quite short of supply is artillery, right? And I think that the Russians now, and when you're in kind of this kind of World War I style battle, right, in eastern Ukraine, artillery matters a lot as a key part of the ability to operate. And the second one, Jason, we saw this weekend, right, the importance of it, and that's air defense systems. Absolutely critical. David Ignatius, the columnist for the foreign policy columnist for the Washington Post was in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago. He did an interview with President Zelensky, who really went into this, right? Basically said that is key for us, right? We need to have continued air defense, rocket defense, and mechanisms, right? And our armaments are from the West. If you don't have that, you can imagine what would have happened in Israel this week, and if Israel hadn't had that level of air defense and rocket defense. We can imagine what can happen in Ukraine if they don't. And you see it right now. You see it, the second largest city in Ukraine, Kharkiv, right, is under assault by the Russians constantly, and they're trying to make it unlivable. And essentially what happens there, and I'll finish up on this, is you have what had been a World War I trench warfare operation in the eastern part of Ukraine. It then becomes a World War II style bombing big cities, right, and making those cities unlivable, right? If you can't push back both their aircraft and the missiles and rockets that they can fire you. And I'll finish up on this. Ukraine has a much harder problem, which is why it needs these systems so badly. You know, the Israelis dealt with the Iranian attack this weekend. Iran is 1,100 miles from Israel, right? Russia is not 1,100 miles from Ukraine, right? So the distances are so much shorter, right? You know. Secondly, Ukraine is a lot bigger than Israel, right? Geographically, right? In terms of territory, much bigger place to defend, right? You know, and the third is, you know, a lot of the drones over the weekend were shot down not by missile defense systems, right? But were shot down by F-35 aircraft. Obviously the Ukrainians do not have that kind of air force, right, to be able to kind of go back at drones launched from Russia. It's a really serious situation. And it's exceedingly irresponsible for us not to support them at this point with the measures that are before Congress.
We have a little time left, but I wanted to, and we're mostly talking about national security given your focus and your background, but I wanted to just ask you to reflect back on the remarks you gave here 11 years ago. Again, you talked about two things: climate as an urgent national security issue, and you also talked about something that was kind of just rising to the surface, or at least for many people. Some parts of the country may have seen it coming far before, but the significant shift of the U.S. to becoming a much larger oil and gas producer. And just to put it in context, I went back and looked, and what you said at the time was, in 2005, 60% of U.S. oil was imported. Today, the number is 40 and falling, a dramatic move toward fulfilling the president's goal of cutting oil imports in half by 2020. Of course, we became a net exporter, so it's just how significant that change was. But as we saw, there's understandable concern about the surge in production when we just had COP28 call for moving away from transitioning away from fossil fuels. And we're running out of time to bring emissions down. So just talk about today how you see the role of the U.S. in the global energy landscape and also climate landscape.
Well, we're running out of time here, but on that, I mean, the speech that I gave here, which we worked on, the kind of the roots of that speech for our years together in the executive branch, you know, had two focus, right? One was, and two things were happening at an incredible speed, right? The first was this dramatic change in the U.S. energy supply situation, and essentially, but the United States was becoming a country that had, since the 1970s, regarded itself as an energy-poor nation. A nation that was kind of that was dependent on oil and buffeted by events far beyond its borders, right? And that was changing pretty dramatically. Was kind of the first, and the second, of course, was the transcendent issue and the kind of the accelerating issue of climate. And those are the two focuses of the speech. You know, reflecting back on it, we've obviously had on the energy supply side dramatic changes. The United States right now, obviously, as everybody here knows, is the largest supplier in the world of natural gas and oil. And that's been important to kind of meet the demand as we move towards and hopefully accelerate the transition to a cleaner energy world. You do have to reflect, though, Jason, on kind of what the impact of that has been on the U.S. economy and its geopolitical position in the world, including, you know, we were just talking about Ukraine, including the ability to supply natural gas to European allies after the invasion of Ukraine. And also to kind of look back again on kind of the economic changes in the United States and what the benefits were of that. At the same time, the United States, under the Biden administration, has pushed to try to accelerate the transition pretty aggressively. And I think that was kind of hopefully foreshadowed in the speech as well. And, the Biden administration obviously has set aggressive goals, engaged in diplomacy, and obviously has an intense regulatory agenda. But also, I was reflecting, preparing for today on the Inflation Reduction Act as one element of that, which has been an extraordinary piece of legislation, right? I mean, it was well designed, it had the right incentives, it was pretty simple, and it's long range, right? And so, what's going to happen there is basically, I think the current estimates by different banks on the street right now are that, in fact, the level of incentive will be maybe $1 trillion over the next 10 years, and it might produce 3x that in investment in clean energy, which would be an extraordinary outcome, I think, for us. So I think both. I think that that the United States obviously have to reflect back on what the situation would have been economically and geopolitically for the United States absent that change in demand, right? Supply, right? And also the importance of kind of moving forward with initiatives like the Inflation Reduction Act.
So very briefly, close on, we have a lot of young people who will be coming out of grad school or college looking for jobs soon. And how do you get a job in the White House straight out of college? And how do you manage a national convention at the age of 24?
Well, all right, Jason, here's the deal. So you were trying to be polite at the beginning. You mentioned I started my career in the Carter administration. So I'm looking around the audience here, and the students, right? You might as well have said he worked in the Benjamin Harrison administration, right? So I got that right. Kind of a historic event for most people as I look around in this audience. I was very lucky with mentors and had opportunities. Again, I started working in the White House when I was 21 years old. My first big job was for President Carter was in this city, where I managed the convention down the street here in Madison Square Garden. And it was one of the great nomination battles in the modern history of the Democratic Party. It was the battle between Senator Ted Kennedy challenging then incumbent President Jimmy Carter for the nomination. And I was fortunate enough to be able to manage that convention and learn a lot about politics. Keep on moving, right? Is my advice, right? Be open to lots of things and changes. And my career obviously has changed radically, right, a number of times, right, from, I don't think when I was sitting in the trailer and deep into Madison Square Garden worrying about delegates from, Illinois, right, that I could see myself as national security advisor, right, but it was things have worked out.
You were lucky with mentors, and I was as well, and you've been one of them, so thank you. Please join me in thanking Tom Donilon.